Ai, aloha hou mai kākou. E ho'omau aku kākou ma ka Haʻawina ʻike Aukahi o ka pule nei. Nānā kākou I ka mahele ʻelua o ka moʻolelo ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. E ho'omau aku ana ma luna o ka moʻolelo o kēlā pule aku nei. Yeah. So let's kind of ground this first in taking a look at some mana'o from Ngugi wa Tiongo, who writes that language is a vast system of naming the world, which expresses that community's total relationship to their environment, their economic activities, their political and social relations, and ultimately their view of themselves in the world. Oppressors and their oppressing system understand that it is not enough for them to seize people's land, impose their rule, but they go further and control the culture and the value system of the conquered. Economic and political control are incomplete without cultural control. The entire edifice of economic, political, and cultural control remains shaky without control of the mind of the conquered. Hence, in history, the conqueror has always felt it imperative to control the mind of the conquered. The easiest route to that conquest is language. Okay, and he also says that the effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environments, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one of wasteland, of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. Right? So, again, just kind of think about some of the things that we saw last week, right? With the overthrow in 1893, the banning of language in 1896, the mo'olelo that we know of our kupuna, for being punished, right, for speaking their language, especially in schools. And then also that 1907 program of patriotic exercises that we saw spread across the so-called United States of America and all the public schools, right? One nation, one flag, one language. Okay. Okay, another thing we'll take a quick look at is a quote from John Henrik Clarke, who says that history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells the people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, an understanding of history tells the people where they still must go and what they still must be. Okay? And again, connecting that to the loss of language and all that was lost with it, right? Our stories, our history, our culture, so on and so forth. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a quote from Richard Armstrong. Richard Armstrong was the president of the Board of Education, the Minister of Public Instruction. Prior to that, later became the Board of Education. And again, the same one that we're talking about today, right? The one that was founded by Kauai Keaoli in 1840 into 1841. And he is a Haole missionary who kind of launches the English Mainly campaign. Yeah. And so he's pushing hard in the government to increase the amount of English language schools, even to the detriment of Hawaiian language schools. And there's a lot that we could talk about as it relates to Richard Armstrong. There's a lot of things that he did, but we'll just go with one of his quotes where he says during this time that the language of a nation is part of its very being and never was and never will be changed except by a very gradual process. That of Hawaiians is no exception to the general rule. Right, so he acknowledges, right, in all of his efforts to limit ʻŌlelo Hawaii and increase English, that the language of a nation is part of its very being, right? And then therefore one could easily argue that to change the language is to change its very being, right? But he also recognized that it was not going to be accomplished overnight, right? That this could only be done by a very gradual process. And again, this situation for the Hawaiians is no exception to the general rule. It was not then, and it is not now, right? It's still the same thing as we think about trying to revitalize our language, right? It's not as simple as just sending our keiki to school and then they learn it and then they know it, and so therefore it's, it's pa'a, right? To make it part of our very being again will be a very gradual process, right? It's gonna take time, and when we're talking about time, really we're talking about generations, right? And so we'll continue on with that mana'o in a little bit. Okay, so Armstrong is the Minister of Public Instruction, President of the Board of Education from, I think it's like 1848 until he passes away in 1860. When he passes away, Matayo Kekuanoa becomes the president of the Board of Education. And in 1864, there is a lot of discussion around the medium of education in Hawaii and the language of the people in the country. And so Kekuanoa explains, Dr. Anderson, secretary of the ABCFM, that's the missionary company, right, whose experience of almost half a century among the missionary schools of the Oriental and Polynesian nations eminently qualifies him to decide upon the practicability of teaching English to our people and the advantages to be derived from it. He has declared that the result of frequent and most expensive trials in all those countries prove not only the impracticability, but the greatest disadvantages to the nation of such a system as compared to one based on the language of the country, right? He's saying that to teach a people and a nation through English, the language that is not the language of their country, right, is impractical. It's impractical, right? And it creates disadvantages to the nation who is being taught in the language that they do not speak. So he goes on to say and explain that if we wish to save the lives of the people, if we wish to perpetuate our race and preserve the Hawaiian kingdom independent and prosperous in the land that God has given to Hawaiians, we must improve our common schools for its future fathers and mothers, that they may learn the natural laws of health and how to hold their own when brought in competition with the foreigner. Okay, so these common schools are what we could refer to as, if we were to bring it in today's day and age, right, these are the kulakaiopuni. Yeah, these common schools are the kulakaiopuni. The select schools, on the other hand, would be what we're kind of thinking of as the DOE. Yeah, the regular DOE, ʻIke. Okay, so again, through the time of Armstrong, right, lots of money and attention and effort and energy was put into the English schools, not so much into the Hawaiian schools. And so they see already the deterioration of them and this need to improve it, right, to save the lives of the people, to perpetuate the race, to preserve independence and prosperity. He continues on, the attempt to give Hawaiian children whose language out of school, in the playground and at their homes is exclusively Hawaiian, in education and day schools through the medium of English textbooks, only, has not met with success enough when compared with the advantages to be derived from a common school education in their own language to warrant the change in favor of the English. Okay, so again, he's right, this change that's happening back then, as we can see with our kupuna who have the stories, right, that this is only happening in school. The language that our people speak outside of school is still ʻŌlelo Hawaii. that's still part of their very being, right? This attempt to change it, to quote Armstrong, is a very gradual process, okay? And so these efforts in school, not only through to changing the language, but also to the actual success of education, have not been met with enough success, right? Compared to just having a common education in your own language. Okay, so again, we can see that even just this switch, right, according to Kekuano'a's arguments, right, it's not just a switch of language, but it would actually put Hawaiians at a disadvantage in the educational system, right? And make connections to today if you want. Yeah. So he continues on, we must consider that Hawaii stands as an independent kingdom among the states of the earth. Our people possess a full and comprehensive language that can be read and written by almost every individual in the land. Yeah, this is not a limited language, right? Full and comprehensive. And we saw that last week. We had a Department of Education, right? We achieved independence. Again, the fire departments and the police departments and these departments that we think of today come from the kingdom, right? We were a fully functioning country, recognized as equals to the great powers of that time, America, France, Great Britain. And our language was the language of that country. History teaches us that the life of every nation depends upon the preservation of its individuality among other nations. The theory of substituting the English language for the Hawaiian in order to educate our children is as dangerous to Hawaiian nationality as it is useless in promoting the general education of the people. Again, comparing this with what we saw last week, 1907, one language, one country, one flag, right? That the use of English language instead of Hawaiian to educate our children, or for us, our kupuna, is not only useless to promoting the general education of the people, and again, make those connections if you want, but it's also dangerous to Hawaiian nationality. Yeah. Hawaiian thinking, Hawaiian being. Reverend Charles McEwen Hyde explains, and this is coming around from the time of the overthrow, right? He explains that the Americanization of the islands will necessitate the use of the English language only as a language of business, politics, education, and church service. Okay, right? So again, for what purpose? Americanization, right? Again, opposite of the things, back on the side of Richard, on the opposite spectrum of Kekuano'a and the arguments that he's making, right? But both really saying the same thing, just on opposite sides of the argument. And then Reverend McArthur, again, around the same conversation, around the same time, the present generation will generally know English. The next generation will know little else. Here is an element of vast power in many ways, right? And again, as Kekuano'a has already highlighted for us, not power for Hawaiians, right? But power for those who are in control. And again, this being around the time shortly thereafter, the overthrow and the illegal annexation of Hawaii to America. Okay, so here's some ʻŌlelo Hawaii perspectives coming from Kanupepa Kealoha Aina, the Kealoha Aina newspaper, 11 July 1896. In an article entitled "The Pūnana Leo Hawaii," the writer writes, "Amina mina loa mākou I ka ʻike ana, ua hoʻona au po ia lākou I ka ʻōlelo makuahine o ko lākou aina. I mea e hoʻolilo loa ia I ka noʻonoʻo ana no ka aina e. Ka aina nona mai ka poʻe nana oia I aʻo mai." Right? So they're saying that we're, extremely sad and disappointed in seeing and realizing that our people have been neglected from learning and knowing their mother tongue, yeah, of their birthland, as a means to trade away and to change, right, their way of thinking to that of foreign lands, the lands from where their teachers come from. A'ohe lāhui I ho'onele ia pono mawaina o na lāhui nui o ke ao nei. No laila, mai ho'opuina ia ka ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. Right? There's no nation among the great nations of the world who have been deprived of this right of knowing, speaking their language. So therefore, let us not forget the Hawaiian language. Let us not neglect it. Samuel Manayakalani Kamako, famous Hawaiian historian, he explains, he makemake ko'u e pololei ka mo'olelo o ko'u one hānau. A'ale naka malihini e a'o ia'u I ka mo'olelo o ko'u lāhui. Na'u e a'o aku I ka mo'olelo I ka malihini. Yeah, that I have a desire for my history, my stories of my birth stands to be correct, yeah, to be accurate. Not to have a foreigner teach me the story and the history of my people, but I shall teach them. And again, looking at the things that have been done, many of us have been put in a situation opposite of what Kamako is explaining, right? That we have had our histories, our stories told to us by foreigners in a foreign language. And related to that, Robert Morris is quoted in Puakea Nogomeyer's book, Mai Pa'aika Leo. He explains, translation has always been one of the most powerful ways to regulate knowing because it is a tool in the hands of someone with superior knowledge. For example, the translator who knows both languages. Whoever needs the translation knows only one language and is therefore at the mercy of the translator. The power relationship between the two is one of dependency on the part of the monolingual reader. Right? So again, one of the problems of what Kamako was talking about, right? We don't want our stories and our history to have to be told to us, right? We should know them and should be the ones telling others what it is. But again, these are things that are lost when language is lost, right? Because we come from a people who recorded these things in our language. So we lose the language, we lose the history, we lose the stories, we lose the culture, right? And we lose, again, to go back to Richard's, the way of our very being. Okay, some more. Now from Nupepo Ku'oko'a, 1873. Right, o ka ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi, oia ka ʻŌlelo a keia lāhui. O ka ʻŌlelo a kekahi lāhui, oia ke ki e wehe ai a ʻike leʻa I ka manaʻo, ka makemake, a me nā pono nui o nā kanaka a pau o ia lāhui. Right, Hawaiian language is the language of this nation, of this people, of this race. The language of a nation is the key that opens and allows one to understand all their wishes and needs for the people of that country, of that race. And Joseph Mokuʻohai Poi Poi explains in Kana Iopuni, ua ʻŌlelo ia e nā kākā ʻŌlelo o ka mākaukau ma na moʻolelo o kou ʻaina makuahine ke keʻehina ʻike mua ma ke kālai ʻaina, e hiki ai ke paio no ka pono o ka nohona aupuni ʻana. It's been said by the great orators and advisors that understanding the history of your homeland is the first step, is the first political step towards fighting for the rights of your nation and your country. A couple more. ʻike ia no ke kanaka no kekahi lā hui ma kāna ʻōlelo. Ina e nalo wale ana ka ʻōlelo makuahine o kekahi lā hui, e nalo hia aku ana no ia lā hui. I keia lā, ua nalo hia aku ko kākou kuʻokoʻa, a I ka pau ana o ka kākou ʻōlelo makuahine, o ka pau ana no ia o ka lā hui Hawaiʻi. Yeah, it's been explained in ka puʻuhonua o nā Hawaiʻi, 26 January 1917, that a nation or a person is recognized to belonging to a certain race based on their language. If their national language, their mother tongue is lost, then so too will be lost that nation. Today, right, our independence has been lost. And if our language, our mother tongue, is lost as well, then the Hawaiian people will be no longer. And John Wise explains, I ʻike ia no na aupuni o ke au nei, a I hoʻomaopopo ia no lākou ma kā lākou ʻōlelo. I ka manawa e nalo wale ai kā lākou ʻōlelo lā hui, o ka nalo wale ana no ia o ia lā hui kanaka. He mau ʻōlelo o ia I o ke ia, ʻaʻale e hiki ke hoʻonalo wale ia iho. Right, and he basically explains the same exact thing as above and says that this is in fact the truth and it cannot be denied. Right, and Jen, just to go back to this really quickly, right, they're not saying that if the language is lost, then, oh my God, all the Hawaiians gonna die, right? But if the language is lost, then the Hawaiianness of the Hawaiians, of the Lahui, that's what's gone. Yeah, again, the very being. And so when we talk about, right, eola ka ʻōlelo Hawaiʻi and how come we gotta, you know, it's a lot of work. It's a slow, very gradual process, right? It takes time. And it's not just waiting around kind time. It's working kind time. It's doing kind time. Yeah, it's taking action kind time to save the language. And George Helm explains, right, far worse than man not having land is man not having identity, aspects of culture, pride, and self-esteem, right? And again, thinking back to what Ngugi Wa Tiongo is saying, what we saw from John Henrik Clarke, and all these other quotes, and Richards talking about the very being, right? We can make the connection. Far worse than man not having land is man not having identity, aspects of culture, pride, and self-esteem. Again, the Hawaiianness of the Lahui. And so, as we kind of wrap this up, I've been saying Richard Armstrong this whole time, right? Richard Armstrong, his quote, and him, going back to him being the Minister of Public Instruction and the President of the Board of Education, right? So again, looking at this, not all missionaries shared Richard Armstrong's views. Lauren Andrews, who is author of one of the older Hawaiian language dictionaries, he explains that if language is to taught to any advantage, many years must be spent. Yeah, much expenses, all those things that we saw earlier in another quote. But he says towards the bottom, third line from the bottom, right? For the government to set up English schools to the neglect of educating its own people in their own language would, in my opinion, be a suicidal act. Again, connecting this with the quotes that we've seen before from Armstrong and Tiongo and Kekua Noa. And then Reverend Lorenzo Lyons, yeah, right? He says, I've studied Hawaiian for 46 years, but am by no means perfect. It is an interminable language. It is one of the oldest living languages of the earth, as some conjecture, and may well be classed among the best. The thought to displace it or to doom it to oblivion by substituting the English language ought not for a moment to be indulged. E ola ka ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. Yeah, long live the grand old poetical Hawaiian language. And lastly, Noel Warner explains in one of his articles that Hawaiian language should be perpetuated because it is part of Hawaiian heritage, what can help to make Hawaiians whole again as a people. Hawaiians need to learn and know their language, culture, stories, histories, and religion because they interrelate and are integrally linked to one another and to the people. Okay. No leila, things will get hard. It's a huge commitment to be not just part of Pūnana Leo, but to be a part of the language revitalization movement and these efforts. It gets tiring. It can sometimes get lonely. ʻAha, based on all the things that we've seen here, we may now have a better understanding of why so much effort was put into minimizing and restricting ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi to the point where in 1980 there were less than 50 native speakers under the age of 18. Right? When we understand those things a little bit more clearly, and to the reasons and the advantages that some might have over us because of that, then it helps us understand a little bit more clearly why all the hard work and perhaps the hard times in the struggle to revitalize it is necessary and to our benefit. Yeah. Ano leila, mea mana'o e na makua e ho'omana'o kākou. Yeah. Let us always remember not just the what of what we do, but the most important thing is to always understand the why of what we do. And if we keep the why in mind, we'll always make time for the what. Yeah. No leila, oia ka Haʻawina Aukahi o keia pule, a hui hoa ku kākou. Aloha.